Discuss one of the most fantastic passages in all the Bible, really. I'm trying to study through the whole Tanakh from cover to cover, and right now I'm up to Isaiah 45, Yeshayahu Mem Hey. I just read that chapter. Mem Daled and Mem Hey I read today in my quest to complete the whole Tanakh, which is something I did, many years ago, and something I remember my Rebbe in high school, Moshe Weinberger, was a big Rav now in Woodmere, and he's a big mashpia at Yeshiva University, his old alma mater. He said, how could it be, God wrote a whole book for us, and if someone after 120 could say they didn't read the whole Tanakh cover to cover, and I was inspired to do so again. Some friends of mine on Twitter gave me some extra chizik, even though I thought of it on my own, and then a friend of mine, Rabbi Siegel, he said that he personally does so himself, and I, expressed how I sometimes have difficulty doing it. And he said, "No, just read through it." And what I realized, my difficulty was I really want to get into it. Meaning, like, I also study Mishnayos. I'll finish Shas Mishnayos maybe twice a year usually, and I just usually read through the Mishnayos, 2, 3, 4 prakim a day. Sometimes more. I've done even in 1 month the whole Shas Mishnayos, 18 prakim a day. The Tanakh, and I'm familiar with the Mishnayos thanks to that, and that's the idea of Mishnah, to repeat it over. And Tanakh, it's interesting, I always had a desire to learn Tanakh, I was always interested in learning Tanakh, but I found myself having difficulty committing to it, and for years I was trying to make a commitment, and Baruch Hashem, I've made it this far this time around, and the I've gotten from my various friends and forth. So I remember as a youth, I was a teenager for sure, I was in high school, and it was during the time when I was going through the Tanakh in those days. And trying to remember exactly which occasion I'm recalling. What I seem to recall was Pesach, Chol Hamoed Pesach, and I was on a bus, and on the bus with me was the Catholic priest. It was that whole bus ride was something very interesting, because initially I remember being there, and Catholic, and I think at the time I had the Tehillim, and the priest asked me what my favorite psalm was. It was interesting to me that he told me his favorite was Psalm 119, which talks about Ahavas Torah, love of the Torah, that was just fascinating to me, that whole exchange there. And then, it was Chol Hamoed Sukkos, not Chol Hamoed Pesach, because I had the lulav and esrog with me. So it was Chol Hamoed Sukkos, and he asked, the significance of the palms, similar to his own tradition. And then after he got off the bus, and he also mentioned to me that he took math courses at Yeshiva University. I remember he mentioned that as well, this particular priest. And then when he got off the bus, there was a young man who was Jewish, and he was there with a friend of his who was Christian. And this Jewish young man, I don't know if he belonged to a Reform or Conservative congregation, but he was very active in the congregation. And the rabbi was amazed. He was telling me how the rabbi was amazed by how active a young man like him, he was older than me, was in the congregation, because most of the congregation are old, unlike how in our congregations you have all ages from, in the Orthodox congregations it's really truly intergenerational, whereas in the liberal congregations they have a very hard time maintaining the youth. And I remember he asked if he could borrow the lulav and esrog to bench lulav. And I was, of course, happy to do so. That was, it was an exciting thing for me to share that with him. And the look on his face, we're on the Greyhound bus going from Monticello to Queens, and the look on his face I mean, he got on somewhere else. Both, they were, different people got on different stops. And I was going from Monticello to Queens. And the look on his face, I think my sister was there with me. The look on his face when he was shaking the lulav. I wish I had that hislavus, Beautiful, the enthusiasm that he had. But that was after the priest got off the bus. But I remember I was in discussion with the priest, something I'd seen on television that surprised me so much. And I said it in a respectful way, but I remember shortly before that seeing an interfaith dialogue between a priest and a rabbi, and the priest referred to something he called Deutero-Isaiah. I'm not going to discuss why he said that, the context of what he was discussing. But he said, what he said was Jews and Christians often debate about certain passages in Deutero-Isaiah. And I was like, how could it be that a man who takes the type of oaths that are required of a Catholic priest, so obviously takes his religion very seriously, can use such a prostoloshin as Deutero-Isaiah? What does it mean? There's a heretical idea that there were two authors to Isaiah, and that from the 40th chapter on was a different person altogether who wrote Isaiah. Beryl Wine, I was listening to a recording that was just recently of Wine. He's visiting the United States, I guess, I think, and he was asked to speak in Yeshiva University, and on yutorah.org I listened to a lecture from Beryl Wine about Inyanim of Pesach, a very nice shir, and I remember when I was in Or Sameach, running into Rabbi Wine every now and then. I remember one time I was visiting Yerushalayim with the Biala Rebbe, and in the hotel was a television. I turned on the television, it was Beryl Wine, so I watched this lecture. And then I was like, what am I doing watching television in Yerushalayim? I should go visit my friends, something. So I went over to Or Sameach and I saw Rabbi Wine, and I said, oh, I just saw you on TV. So he said, thank you. So he tells a story that I remember that he said when he was in yeshiva, maybe in high school, the boys got interested in different ideas. They went through their different discussions, things that they were interested in at various times. And one thing that became interesting to the boys was Bible criticism. And so they said they had one Maggid Shir, one Rebbe, who was such a brilliant genius, and at first they were offended by it until they realized how incredible it was what he was doing, was that he could read a newspaper and give the shir at the same time, give his Talmud lecture, which is very difficult, and meanwhile be reading a newspaper or something else at the same time. He was able to multitask in a way that most people cannot do, because generally there's no such thing for most people. Some people can multitask, but most people are just doing micro tasks and switching back and forth, but he was somehow able to totally do both at the same time. So they would sometimes give him books to read while he was giving his lecture. And they found this one book written by Zionist heretics, secular heretics in Israel, and it was written in Hebrew. That's why I mentioned that. And the chutzpah that they had was, in talking about Bible criticism, is that they actually had a picture with a caption underneath it. A man with a beard. How so many artists depict biblical prophets, and it was a picture of a man with a beard, and the caption underneath said Yeshayahu Hasheni, the second Isaiah, author of Isaiah 40 till 66. There are some Bible critics who even suggest there were 3 or even 4 authors to Isaiah. Rahman al-Islam. And so I was expressing some, and so Rabbi Wine says that the boys presented this book to to their Magid Shir, to their Rebbe, to the lecturer in yeshiva, while he's giving the shir, that he's reading it while he's giving the lecture, and without stopping, once he got to that point, with the picture, it says Yeshayahu Hasheni, the second Isaiah, he picked up the book and threw it, and it landed right in the garbage. And he said, from then on, those boys were cured of Bible criticism. So again, I was shocked. The Catholic priest who devotes so much of his life and takes such serious oaths and vows in his life, if he's really serious about it, and he seemed like an honest person, this man I was talking to, could believe in Bible criticism, could accept that there was more than one Isaiah. I don't understand it. When in actuality, yes, we know Rashi says that Isaiah changes his tune, but it's the same person. And in our discussion, we discussed how, in the end of Isaiah 44, 44:28, and then into Isaiah 45, it mentions Cyrus, by name, King Cyrus by name, Koresh. In Isaiah 44:28, Yeshayahu Mendalad Chav Ches, it says, Omer leChoresh ro'i chol chefzi yashlim, v'leimor liyushalayim tiboneh v'heichol tivased. It says, the one who says to Cyrus, my shepherd, and all of my desires, and to say to Jerusalem, be built and establish, put down the foundations of the temple. And then in Isaiah 45, the next verse, Isaiah 45:1 says, Koyamar Hashem l'mishicho l'choresh asher chzami rad l'fanav goyim emasnei melochem afateich l'ftoach l'fanav d'lasayim mishrayim l'sageru. Anyway, the point is, it says, thus says the Lord to his anointed one, to Cyrus, by the right hand, to go down before the nations, and the loins of the kings will be open, to open before him the doors and the gates that will not be closed. And it has a whole prophecy dedicated to Cyrus, a man who would not be born for many hundreds of years later. And he's named by name. And this priest, when we were discussing, he said, well, maybe, would you believe, possibly, would you be open to accept that, yes, Isaiah wrote the whole book of Isaiah, including this chapter, and the only thing was this name Koresh, this name Cyrus, was added later, in the days of Cyrus. Because it's so incredible. How do you have a prophecy that mentions someone by name who wouldn't be born for hundreds of years later? And just in simple faith, like a good Breslover chassid, with simple faith, the way Rabbi Nachman taught, I said, no. I believe with simple faith that Isaiah wrote the whole book of Isaiah, including the two times that he mentions Koresh by name, he mentions Cyrus by name. But that was that. We didn't really discuss it more. But it would seem that, he was open at least to the idea that Cyrus, the name Cyrus, was added later. Now, I didn't really give any apologetic argument to defend why I believed that Isaiah mentioned Cyrus by name and that the name was not added later. I just said so out of simple faith, which is the proper path. But let's see, from the context of the prophecy that's given to Koresh, and interestingly, that also answers, a lot of people say that the book of Daniel is talking about the Messiah. It's actually, our commentators say in one point it's talking about Koresh, another point it's talking about who was the last king, Debiyanai, whatever it is. But let's just look at the context of this to say why it is. And it's an incredible thing. And I've heard other preachers say how incredible it is that Isaiah mentioned Cyrus by name, and I definitely believe that this is authentically written by Isaiah. I looked at all the commentaries I could find. No one was shocked by this, meaning all of our Rishonim and Achronim accepted with simple faith that Isaiah prophesied about Cyrus by name. And they weren't amazed by it, weren't shocked by it, they didn't question it, they just accepted it very simply. And that's our tradition. And that's what, now, people would say, we don't have really any older manuscripts. The oldest we have is the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's still after the time of Cyrus, well after the time of Cyrus, hundreds of years later. So, do we have any proof? Still, I accept this with simple faith. But let's look at the text of Isaiah 45 and see, do we have any things that could support this idea that it was not added later? Let's engage in a little bit of apologetics just for that sake. So two things that we have that Isaiah says very quickly, very briefly, that I think prove that it's indeed talking directly to Cyrus. The whole prophecy is obviously talking to him, but that the name is mentioned specifically Cyrus. We see in the 4th verse, even though there are commentaries that understand this differently, this idea is what Rashi, however, brings out. First of all, in the 3rd verse, in chapter 3, Rashi says this. It says, "V'nasati lecha otzros choshech batnunei mistarim, l'man teda ki ani Hashem hakori v'shimcha alokei Yisrael." So it says, "And I have given you the treasures of darkness and the hidden things that are secret, in order that you should know that I am the Lord who calls by your name the God of Israel." And then it goes, comma, the God of Israel. And then it says again, for the sake of, in verse 4, "For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, and I call unto you by your name, and I give you a title, and you did not know me." So Rashi says, "Hakori v'shmecha," in verse 3, "Adayin noiladata v'ni kari lechem shem koresh," meaning you weren't born yet, not for hundreds of years later, you were not born, and I'm still calling you by the name Cyrus, Koresh, in order to take me out from Babel. So we see that's the meaning of this passage. That you can't just say that this name Cyrus, Koresh, was added later, as this priest was suggesting, for this very simple reason that the passage in the chapter says twice, "I call you by your name." And now what about something specific to Koresh that I, think is significant to a certain extent? One of the most important verses in the Nevi'im, in the works of the prophets, to teach Jewish theology is this verse 7 in our chapter, in chapter 45, verse 7. And it's actually paraphrased in our liturgy, in our daily liturgy, in the morning prayers. It says, "Yotzer or uvorei choshech, osei shalom uvorei ra, ani Hashem osei chol eileh." It says, "He who forms light and creates darkness." That's what we have in our liturgy. And the liturgy continues, "He makes peace," and then it changes, and then it says, "And he creates evil. I am the Lord who does all of this." How our liturgy changes it a little bit. It says, "He who forms light and creates darkness, who makes peace and creates everything, which includes both good and evil. So theologically, it's not a problem. But why would this be directed to Cyrus? Well, what religion was Cyrus? He was a Persian king. And what was the Persian religion? Was the Zoroastrian religion, which believed in dualism, that there was a good God and a bad God who were fighting. And that's where a lot of the Western ideas of God and Satan being at odds with each other, which is not a biblical idea by any stretch of the imagination. The biblical idea is that Satan is a servant of God and only an enemy of man, perhaps, or an opposer of man. What some people say is kind of like a drill sergeant or a personal trainer, that, when the drill sergeant, like chews you out and yells at you, and it's to make you stronger. And so the same thing, the Satan is to give us challenges that we can overcome, but he really doesn't want us to overcome. The Zohar says something like that there was a king who wanted to test the piety of his son, the prince, to see if he was worthy of the next king. And so he hired a woman of ill repute to tempt him, but she really didn't want to win, but she had to do her job the best that she could to tempt him, because that was her job that she was hired to do. She was hoping that she would not be successful in what she was trying to accomplish. And similarly, that's how the Yetzer Hara, the devil, is Satan, is seen in Judaism as someone that God hired to do the task of testing us and making us better and seeing how good we are, and not to be an enemy of God that's fighting God the way that so much of Western culture sees, is someone that God created. He's very difficult for us to deal with, but God could destroy him in a second, and eventually will, as is prophesied. That being said, so this is like a smack in the face to Cyrus, who is a dualist in his religion, to say, no, that's not true. There's only one God who does everything. The good God is not equal to the evil God. The good God is superior to all the things he created, to the point where the forces of evil are also under the control of one singular good God who creates evil for his own reasons. Rashi says here, he gives light and good and peace to the righteous, and darkness and evil to the wicked, for example, to the Babylonians. And in that case, here Cyrus was brought to fight against the Babylonians, and so therefore he was bringing that evil upon them that they deserved, destroying their kingdom, replacing it with the Persian kingdom, and therefore giving freedom of religion to everybody. I remember reading a history book. Actually, I was teaching world history, global history, to a 10th grade class in the yeshiva, and we were discussing the different religions of the world. And so this book said that the Zoroastrians believed very much in religious tolerance, and that's why Cyrus helped the Jews to build their temple, because he believed in religious tolerance, tolerating and respecting other religions, which is very nice. But the interesting thing here is that times in history where there were extremist Zoroastrians, for the most part the Zoroastrians were, and today very tolerant people. It's a very small group today. It's almost I met one time a Zoroastrian, and I know in Rockland County there's a Zoroastrian temple, but there's not very many left in the world. Unfortunately, in Persia and Iran, the Shiite Muslims really wiped out most of the ones who remained mostly fled to India, and that's where there's the largest Zoroastrian community today. But at one time it was a very major religion, and there's discussion among scholars whether is it considered monotheistic or dualistic in its approach. I mean, it certainly had aspects of both in their ideology. So basically, but like I mentioned, there were times when Jews were persecuted by Zoroastrians. It's mentioned in the Mishnah and Shabbos. A lot of people say Friday night, Bama Madlikin, that it says that if you extinguish a lamp, Mipnei Akum, because of people of other religions who are going to persecute you and kill you for having fire in your house, that's talking about the Zoroastrians have a certain holiday, since fire is very much important in their religion. They have a certain time when fire is only allowed in their temple and not anywhere else, not in private homes. So initially, the Zoroastrians only cared that their own co-religionists followed this and didn't impose this on people of other religions. But there were certain times in history when there were more extremist Zoroastrians. The king Scheherazade, I don't remember. There was one Persian king who particularly persecuted the Jews for those two things. One was lighting Shabbos candles, and the other thing was saying the Kriya Shema, saying Shema Yisrael. And so that's why in our liturgy we say the Shema Yisrael. At other times we say it privately, at the beginning of the service, before the korbanos, after brachas, was sometimes called Kabbalas Al Melchu Shemayim, which is well before we say it with the brachas. And so, and that was instituted at that time for that reason, because of the persecution from the Zoroastrians. And also on Shabbos and Yontif during Musaf, in the Kedusha, there's also the words Shema Yisrael. Those were added at that time for that same reason, because the guards would come in at the time when we usually said the Shema, and so they couldn't say it. And so they'd skip it then, and then they would say it later, for the people who didn't come earlier in the davening. And said at that time, before the guards came, they knew that in our liturgy we didn't have Shema Yisrael in Musaf, and so it was added at that point on Shabbos and Yontiv in the Musaf service. So anyway, this verse, Isaiah 45:7, stating this basic idea of Jewish theology, that of total unity of God and the total unity of creation, and how God is the creator of both good and evil, of both light and darkness, even though many theologians will point out that darkness is not a tangible thing, it's the absence of light, and so evil is not a tangible, actual thing, it's only the opposite of good. However, here we see Yotzer Ovorei Choshech, Ose Shalom Ovorei Ra, that there is a creation that's higher than Yetzirah and Asiyah of darkness and evil that God created, even if it means an absence, although certainly Choshech, in the words of our sages, is considered to be something that's tangible. There are two different types of darkness, perhaps. Science has recently discovered like a new type of darkness, like a certain type of material that is completely dark to the point where you wouldn't even be able to tell that it's three-dimensional. It looks two-dimensional when you look at it. You can look that up. It's very interesting. Tyler and Secure Team spoke about that, and it's fascinating, the technology that exists today. But this is the meaning of it. I don't want to get into that too much, because that's not really the point of what we're discussing right now. And the commentators address this, and it's particularly in this prophecy, it's being addressed to the Babylonians, that the evil that's going to come on the Babylonians is a punishment for which again didn't happen yet, and that Koresh would be this individual, Cyrus, would be light to the Jews and darkness to the Babylonians. He would be peace to the Jews and evil to the Babylonians. And he was one person, and so that's also a demonstration to him to show the flaw in his theology of believing in dualism and instead demonstrating the unity that exists there. So I think, to me, maybe not exactly a concept of apologetics, but to me this passage demonstrates in a way that indeed when Isaiah wrote this, hundreds of years before any of these things existed, before they were even aware of these things, I don't even know, I doubt that Isaiah even heard of the Zoroastrian religion. But this was something that God put into his mouth, that God put for Isaiah to write down to Cyrus, a message to Cyrus, demonstrating the faultiness of his own theology, of Cyrus's theology, and the truth of the biblical theology of unity. Again, you might disagree, might have different ideas. I'd love to hear comments on this, but to me this is a fantastic and amazing chapter in Scripture. Isaiah 45, for many reasons, as the whole Scripture is. I'm not denying that, but the message here of real, authentic, basic faith in the Jewish traditions and how we understand the Bible and the authorship of the Bible, to me, I mean, yes, we say that it was the court of Hezekiah that put together some of this, but these are the words of Isaiah. There's not two Isaiahs, and there was no adding of this just one name twice of Cyrus. It seems very obvious from here when it says that that's a direct. It would be too much of a coincidence, even though that type of language appears elsewhere in Scripture. For it to be here like this, the calling by the name would be too much of a coincidence that there would not be a calling by name. And also this, on top of that, the theological message that is apropos to him, not only how the commentators say it, which is definitely true, of how both of them come together, as I demonstrated, of how it's both a message of how Cyrus would be light to the Jews and darkness to the Babylonians, peace to the Jews, evil to the Babylonians. But he's one person. I mean, that's something we see, all throughout history. There are different people who are heroes to one group and villains to another. I mean, that's just a common thing in history. So to me, this is quite fascinating, and also gives me inspiration in my religious walk. I was discussing today in the spirituality group at work the question of the significance of apologetics, which we'll probably have to make another video on that subject, but in brief, I believe that one should not base their faith on apologetics, but only find inspiration from apologetics. And this is connected to something I heard Rabbi Sachs, Chief Rabbi Emeritus, Lord Rabbi Sachs of England. He's the previous Chief Rabbi. He's Chief Rabbi Emeritus. I heard a lecture also on YU Torah, a very nice lecture where he discussed the difference, in Pesach of how do we approach things and so forth. And it's not really what I wanted to discuss right now, but But the point is that exercises in apologetics, on one hand, they can be the seeds of faith, especially for younger people or people who are young in their walk, but they cannot be the basis and the foundation of faith. Certain things have to be unspoken. I remember Moshe Weinberger spoke about that once. He said, if someone asks you, why do you love your spouse, and you give a whole list with a checklist, you're in trouble because you could find someone else better. But if you can't describe why, and you can describe how, but not why, like Shakespeare said, in one of his sonnets, very famous, oh, how I love thee, let me count the ways. He didn't say why I love thee, he said how I love thee. Meaning, I don't know why. I can't express why, I can only express how. And so the same thing, apologetics could be a method of inspiration and improving that relationship with your spiritual walk, whatever it is, and certainly in Judaism, and belief and faith, and what I believe to be the true faith. But it can't be the be-all and end-all, because if it's purely based solely, meaning apologetics can be the seeds to grow one's faith, but they can't be the whole thing, because if they are, well, you find some better apologetics. We discussed that before with the story, from the newspaper a few weeks ago, that came out, Purim, before, hope it was a Purim joke. It's such a sad story. The end is what hurt me more than the whole rest of the story of all the Averis and the Shmutz and the Tumah. That's part of life, but the heresy at the end was what really bothered me more than anything. And because everyone has their struggles with their orthopraxy, but they should try to strive to maintain a simple orthodoxy, and that will help them to gain their orthopraxy. And I don't know, did these people, did they even bother? Did they even ever learn our apologetic literature, the Hilchos Yesodei Torah of the Rambam and the Kuzari and permission to believe and permission to perceive in our current time, and Rabbi Victor Miller, so many contemporary works of Jewish apologetics, and did they even ever bother to read these things? Did they even ever bother to consider them? They just grew up with a certain culture and never were taught the faith. They were taught how to do mitzvahs, and maybe even reasons behind them, but they weren't taught, well, why do we really believe this? What's the basis for our faith? And I think, and these are people who are so passionate and have so much potential to sublimate that passion to God and to abandon God. I mean, if anything, and then they're enjoying what they're doing, and even if what's wrong, if they could sublimate that to at least thanking God for the gifts of pleasure in the world, that would be a start. It would still be flawed and would still be sinful, but it would be a start. It would be heresy, and so that's very hard. Maybe it'll open their eyes. I doubt it. Or maybe someone knows them and can point them in the direction, because it's not that God wants you not to have fun. It's just that He teaches us certain things are more fun than others. But sometimes people have to learn that the hard way, and a lot of people deal with that. That I can commiserate with and have empathy for. But the atheism, the total, but at least they understand the value for their to a certain community. They don't, I don't know. There's still hope, But again, I found this very interesting, Isaiah 45, and again I find apologetics, again, we shouldn't take apologetics as the be-all and end-all of why we believe. There's a certain extent that we do, and that it's appropriate in certain places, but it certainly can inspire someone. This was what Rabbi Sachs was talking about, like, well, maybe I don't, we're not saying that the beauty of the intelligent design that we can find in the world is the proof that our faith is true. Because you can answer in other ways, You think about the moon, the perfection of the location and the probability of that we could have a total solar eclipse exactly perfectly with the shape and the distance and the size and everything of the moon and the sun in relationship to each other, and how incredibly unlikely that is. So there's three possibilities. One, it's it's an unlikely coincidence, which is pretty far-fetched. We believe God made it that way for whatever reason. But some people are like, oh, well, maybe the moon was made by aliens, And I don't deny that there's a very high possibility of some kind of extraterrestrial activity on the moon, or some other activity that we are not aware of, but there have been more biblically based answers to that as well, which I personally would tend to subscribe to, but it's not necessarily anything major. But but that's neither here nor there. But meaning someone who wants to be an atheist but can't accept that it's just an accident that the moon is like that, and many other things about the moon, will say, well, it's aliens, and I don't know, all right, it's aliens, well, who made the aliens? God must have made them. Someone had to make something at the beginning. There has to be a first cause somewhere. I'm not saying there are no aliens. And I'm not even saying that there are no aliens in the moon. I'm not even saying the moon's not hollow. I'm not saying that all that is not true. But who made them? Mi bara kol ela. Who made all of this? That's for a different time. But the point is that even so. These apologetic, why am I saying this? Is because the apologetics can't prove to someone that this is true. But what they do bring out is, to the believer, it enhances the relationship. There's a profundity to it. I remember asking, there's a Gemara in Megillah, this passage in the Talmud in Megillah says, how do we know that the Megillah Esther, the book of Esther, is written Baruch HaKodesh, it was written by divine inspiration? And it says, it says that it records that Haman said in his heart, it knew his thoughts. So then the question is, so that doesn't prove anything. It could all just be a fictional account. It doesn't have to be historical. And so I remember asking Rabbi Dax in Ezra Academy that question. He said, that question was not in an apologetic sense for the non-believer to prove to the non-believer, but rather to answer to the believer why it wasn't for them, it was for us. And in a way, if we view some apologetics like that, it might not convince everybody. It might not even convince us. But is it beautiful, inspirational, and does it improve our relationship? Maybe yes. And that's the value in it. All right. Well, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much.